It's time to settle in. Let the day fade and let this quiet moment be yours. If you can, dim your lights. Let the room fall into a soft golden glow, or perhaps just the gentle blue of night. Tuck yourself under your blanket, feeling the weight and warmth wrap around you like an old friend's embrace. If this calm journey helps you unwind, you might, when you're ready, tap like and subscribe. Only if it feels right. No rush. Tonight it's just you, me, and a story that drifts like steam from a warm teacup. You might hear the faint crackle of a fireplace in your mind, or the whisper of a cool night breeze outside. In here, everything is unhurried. Every word, every breath is simply here to carry you deeper into rest. So let me take you back in time, to a world of kitchens, palaces, and dogs. Not just any dogs, but the royal kitchen dogs of old Korea. Dogs whose paws padded across polished stone floors, whose ears twitched at the clink of porcelain bowls, and whose lives were as curious and delicious as the dishes they were sworn to guard. Let me tell you about the first time I imagined a royal kitchen dog in the Joseon dynasty. It wasn't in a textbook or a museum exhibit. No, it was in a half-forgotten story my grandmother told me one winter night. The air outside had been so cold it felt like the stars were shivering. Inside, the fire hummed softly, and the steam from our barley tea curled into shapes that could have been dragons, or maybe just the warm breath of history. She leaned close, her voice almost conspiratorial. "Did you know," she said, "that the king's kitchen had dogs, special ones, who knew the smell of every royal dish?" I laughed at the time, thinking it was just a folk tale, like those about goblins who love rice cakes. But she nodded solemnly, as if she'd been there herself. And in her telling, those dogs were not just pets. They were guardians of flavour, loyal as any soldier, and far more skilled at catching a thief who smelled like grilled mackerel. Imagine it, the palace kitchens in the mid-15th century, around the time King Seiho sat on the throne. The corridors were wide and polished, echoing with the steady footsteps of court cooks carrying baskets of Napa cabbage, dried anchovies, and earthen jars of fermented soybean paste. The air was a shifting tapestry of scents, the sharp bite of garlic, the mellow depth of doenjang, and the occasional tang of vinegar that made even the dogs sneeze. Now, these royal kitchen dogs weren't the shaggy, floppy kind you might find rolling in the grass. They were sleek, well-groomed and alert, something between a Jindo's quiet dignity and a hound's keen nose. Their coats shone like brushed silk in the lamplight. Their paws were clean enough to walk across white rice paper without leaving a mark. And they had the uncanny ability to tell if a stew had been tampered with, just by sniffing from a respectful distance. There's a small record in the veritable records of the Joseon dynasty, a single line, really, that hints at the existence of these dogs. It notes a palace hound who detected spoilt meat before it was served to the royal table. That's all. Just one line in thousands of pages, but to me that's enough to open a door into a whole forgotten world, and when I picture that world, I can almost hear it. The rhythmic chop of a cook's knife against a wooden board, the soft clink of porcelain lids being lifted from steaming pots, the shuffle of straw sandals over stone, and somewhere near the doorway, the quiet breathing of a dog lying sphinx-like, his tail curled neatly around his paws, his eyes half closed but never entirely asleep. I like to imagine the very first of these palace dogs arriving as a gift. Perhaps a provincial governor hoping to curry favour with the king sent a snow-white pup from a coastal village. The letter might have said, "This dog has the sharpest nose in the province. It once found my lost dried squid from a mile away." The pup would have been carried in a woven basket swaddled in quilted cloth, his small head peeking out as he was brought into the heart of the palace. The cooks, sceptical at first, might have laughed. "What's this? We need knives, not puppies." But then the little one would have pricked up his ears at the scent of boiling beef bones, his nose twitching with every bubble and waft of marrow-rich steam. And when a kitchen boy accidentally left a basket of pears near a damp corner, it was the pup who barked, leading them to find the first signs of mould before it could spread. From that day, the pup had a place by the hearth. His bed was a folded mat near the great iron cauldron, where the heat never quite faded. He grew up listening to the whispers of cooks, the rustle of cabbage leaves, the slow hypnotic churn of kimchi jars being turned in their sleep. He learned the scents of sesame oil, roasted barley, and ginseng roots pulled fresh from the soil. And he also learned the smells that meant trouble. Meat that had been kept too long, rice that had absorbed too much damp, fish that was just beginning to turn. These smells, invisible to human noses, were to him as obvious as a fire on the horizon. Sometimes, I wonder if he knew he was important. Did he understand that his nose could save the king from a bad meal? Or worse, from poison? Perhaps. But I suspect, like most dogs, he simply loved the work. Loved the warmth of the kitchen, the company of the cooks, and the occasional reward of a tiny scrap. Never enough to spoil him, but enough to let him know he was part of the family. The first paw steps of that little dog would echo through decades. Others would follow. Some from far provinces, some born right there in the palace kennels. Each one would learn the art of scent, the rhythm of the royal kitchen, and the unspoken rules. Never beg, never bark without cause, and never, ever let a suspicious smell go unreported. And so, on nights like this, I picture him there, the first of his kind, watching the moonlight spill over the courtyard stones, his ears catching the faint rustle of silk robes somewhere in the distance. The world beyond the kitchen might have been full of intrigue and politics, but here his world was the gentle pulse of the hearth, the quiet pride of his work, and the endless parade of scents that told the story of a kingdom's table. And as we leave that warm kitchen behind, let your mind wander forward to the bustling marketplace where the palace cooks found their freshest ingredients. Let's step outside the palace walls for a while. It's early morning, the kind where the sun hasn't yet decided whether to shine or hide behind a thin veil of mist. The air is cool and damp, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke from nearby homes. You can almost feel the cobblestones underfoot, slick with dew, as we make our way toward the heart of the capital, the great market where the palace's cooks came to buy the freshest treasures of the day. Now, the royal kitchen dogs didn't often roam the market. Their place was the palace, their paws made for polished floors rather than muddy alleys. But there were exceptions. Sometimes a senior kitchen dog, one trusted by all, would be brought along, trotting beside the head cook as if on an official mission. His job? To approve the purchases. Not by taste, though I'm sure he wouldn't have minded, but by scent. Imagine this, a line of market stalls spilling over with colours. Bright green spring onions stacked like bundles of paintbrushes. Fat golden persimmons so ripe their skins could barely hold their sweetness. Strips of red chili peppers drying in the sun like ribbons from a festival. And somewhere between the baskets of beans and the hanging strings of garlic, a stall selling dried fish, their silver scales catching the light in a way that seemed almost hypnotic. The head cook, a man with sleeves rolled high and the calm confidence of someone who knew how to feed a king, would lean down to his canine companion. "What do you think?" he'd murmur, though of course the dog couldn't answer in words. Instead, the dog would step forward, nose quivering, inhaling deeply, a pause, a faint wag of the tail, approval, or perhaps a quiet huff through the nostrils. A subtle no is not as strange as it sounds. Dogs had been trusted with food inspection in Korea for centuries, long before this royal tradition. Their noses could detect what human senses missed. Not just spoilage, but the faint traces of other smells, like oil from a neighbouring stall's lantern or smoke from a nearby brazier. A dog's verdict could mean the difference between a meal that lifted the court's spirits and one that brought an evening of queasy regret. I like to think the market vendors knew these royal dogs by sight. Some might straighten their displays when they saw one coming, brushing stray sesame seeds from the counter. Others, more superstitious, might slip a scrap of dried pollock to the dog, not as a bribe but as a blessing, a little gesture to ensure the palace's favour. The sounds of the market were a world away from the quiet order of the palace kitchens. Here there was the call of vendors singing the virtues of their wares, the clatter of pots and the slap of dough being stretched into noodles. There was laughter, bargaining, the squeak of cartwheels, and always the undercurrent of voices, hundreds of them, blending into a kind of human river. And yet, Within that noisy current, the dog moved calmly, his ears flicking now and then, his gaze steady. The head cook might pause at a spice merchant's table, lifting a small paper packet and unrolling it to reveal fine golden powder. Ground turmeric brought from far away. The dog would sniff, perhaps sneezing delicately if the scent was strong. Some mornings the cook would buy ingredients the palace dogs would never directly smell again. Rice flour for rice cakes shaped into blossoms, or pine nuts to float on the surface of sweet drinks. But the dog's presence was a silent reminder. Everything that entered the palace kitchen was part of a greater trust. History gives us a clue here. In 1530, a record of the royal household's accounts listed an expense for the care of the palace hounds, alongside costs for sesame oil, persimmons and bamboo mats. It's a tiny detail, but it tells us the dogs were not an afterthought. They were part of the system, budgeted for and maintained like any other essential tool of the court. On one particular day, I like to imagine, the head cook returned from the market with more than just ingredients. He brought back a story. There had been a street performer that morning, a man balancing clay pots on his head while playing a bamboo flute. The royal kitchen dog had sat watching, head tilted, as if trying to understand whether this was cooking or magic. When the performer bowed and the crowd clapped, the dog had wagged his tail politely, perhaps in appreciation of a job well done. Back at the palace, the market's treasures would be carried inside, washed, trimmed and prepared. The dog would pad back to his spot by the door, as if nothing unusual had happened. But perhaps in his dreams that night, he would revisit the smells of the market, the sharp vinegar tang of pickled radish, the earthy perfume of fresh mushrooms, the intoxicating aroma of roasting chestnuts. There's something about that thought, the dog dreaming of a marketplace he'd only visit now and then, that makes me smile. Like all of us, he must have carried a few favourite scents in his memory, bringing them out now and then like little souvenirs of a happy morning. And so, from the market's riot of smells and colours, let us wander back inside the palace gates. The day is moving on, and the royal kitchens are about to prepare a dish so curious it could only have been born from a mixture of tradition, accident, and a very patient dog. Picture the palace kitchens at mid-morning. By now, the sun has slipped high enough to spill through the paper windows, soft rectangles of light warming the polished floor. The air is rich with the low, steady bubble of soups and stews, each one simmering in great iron pots set over wood fires. The smoke curls upward and drifts toward the vents in the ceiling, carrying with it scents so layered and deep they could almost be stories themselves. In the corner nearest the main hearth, one pot is different. It's bigger than the others, its wooden lid bound with a strip of linen to keep in the steam. This is no ordinary stew. It's the king's midday meal, a carefully balanced blend of beef brisket, daikon radish, garlic and spring onion, enriched with a spoonful of the palace's oldest soy sauce, brewed for decades until it's as dark as midnight. And lying nearby, not too close to be tempted, is one of the palace's senior dogs. His fur is the colour of toasted rice, his eyes half closed, his ears twitching now and then, as if to agree with the stew's gentle rhythm. He's been here since the pot was set over the fire, as much a part of its cooking as the flames themselves. This wasn't just a charming tradition, it was a quiet form of quality control. The head cook knew that if anything in the stew began to sour, the dog's nose would catch it long before any human did. In a way, the dog was as much a guardian of the king's health as the royal physicians. But let me step sideways for a moment, into a small recorded incident from 1678. In that year, during the reign of King Sukjong, a meal meant for the court was halted before it left the kitchen. The reason? A palace hound refused to sit near one of the dishes, instead pacing and whining in a way that alarmed the cooks. When they investigated, they found a jar of seasoning had spoiled in the summer heat. The dish was remade, the dog given a small pat on the head, and the event quietly noted in the kitchen's daily records. I like to imagine this scene in the current moment, here in our story. The stew bubbles, the dog stirs, rises and pads over, his nose drawing in the steam that escapes as the cook lifts the lid for a heartbeat. His tail wags, slow, steady, certain, approval. The cook smiles faintly, perhaps muttering, "Good, the king will eat well today," He knows this dog, knows his habits. A slow wag means the flavours are balanced, no hint of trouble. A quick, stiff movement of the tail might mean something is off. Not necessarily spoiled, but perhaps too heavy on the vinegar or too light on the sesame. To the outside world, it might sound like superstition, this reading of a dog's movements like tea leaves. But here, in the hushed heart of the palace kitchen, it was both science and art practiced over generations. As the stew nears readiness, the smells deepen, the beef's richness softening into the radish's gentle sweetness, the garlic melting into the soy's dark embrace. If scents had shapes, this one would be a circle, complete and harmonious. Nearby, another cook is pounding rice into a smooth, glutinous paste. The thuds of the wooden mallet slow and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Someone else tends to pickled side dishes, thin slices of cucumber, radish, and lotus root, each marinated in its own precise blend. All of it is part of the king's meal, and all of it must pass through the invisible net of the dog's senses. Sometimes, I think the dogs understood their role better than we give them credit for. They didn't beg. They didn't paw at the cooks. They watched, waited, and worked in their own silent way. And in return, they were treated with respect, fed on the finest scraps after the king's portion was served, and given warm bedding even in the coldest months. The stew is ready now. The cook lifts it from the fire, the lid rattling slightly with the movement. He pours it carefully into a porcelain tureen, the glaze so fine it seems to hum when tapped. The dog steps back, sitting again at his place, the mission complete. Outside the kitchen, the clink of approaching trays can be heard. Servants ready to carry the meal through the winding palace corridors to the royal dining chamber. And here, in the now quiet kitchen, the dog lies down once more, stretching luxuriously, the heat from the hearth soaking into his bones. Perhaps he closes his eyes and drifts into a nap, his dreams filled not with adventures or hunts, but with the slow, spiralling scent of a perfect stew. And as we leave him to his rest, let us walk through another doorway, not into the king's hall, but into a hidden corner of the palace, where the dogs had a space all their own. If you follow the palace corridors far enough, past the busy kitchens and the echoing storage rooms, you eventually reach a quieter corner, a place where the air feels stiller, touched by the rustle of leaves rather than the clang of pots. Here, tucked against a high garden wall, are the royal kennels. They aren't cages, not in the way you might picture. Instead, they're more like small wooden houses, each with a low doorway and a sloping tiled roof, built in a neat row so that the dogs could see one another. Between them, narrow paths of packed earth wind through patches of soft grass. In spring, the grass grew so thick that it felt like walking on a quilt. In autumn, golden leaves from the nearby ginkgo trees would drift down, catching on the dog's fur until they shook them off like bits of sunlight. It's late afternoon now in our story, and the light is falling in that gentle way it does before sunset. Long shadows, a coolness creeping into the air, and a faint golden glow spilling over the kennel roofs. You can hear the faint chattering of sparrows in the garden, and somewhere far away the muffled call of a bell marking the hour. The dogs are home from their shifts in the kitchen. Some are curled up in their houses, paws tucked under their chests, their breathing deep and even. Others lie stretched out in the last patch of sunlight, their ears twitching at the occasional garden sound. A gardener's broom sweeping gravel, the whisper of a silk skirt passing by. Each dog has a name, though few outside the palace know them. Some are named for colours, Beko for a white coat, Hoikdol for black spots. Others carry names that sound almost poetic, Dalbit meaning moonlight, or Sori meaning sound, given to a pup who barked in a soft, almost musical tone. They have their routines here. In the mornings, a young kennel master brings fresh water in glazed bowls, and a careful portion of food, nothing too rich, always balanced. In the evenings, after the dogs return from their duties, their paws are wiped clean with a soft cloth. The palace believed in cleanliness not just for appearances, but for health, and the dogs were treated with the same care as the court's most precious tools. From time to time, the king himself might walk this way. Not often, his duties kept him busy, but on rare afternoons, accompanied by a small retinue, he would stroll through the garden and pause by the kennels. The dogs seemed to know him, standing respectfully, tails wagging but never jumping or barking. A king's hand, when it reached down to pat a head, was a rare and gentle thing. There's a small historical note from 1712 mentioning the royal hounds kept in comfort beside the southern wall. It's not much, just a fragment in the palace records, but it paints this corner of the palace in the soft light of reality. It was a place meant for rest, safety, and the quiet pride of those who served in fur instead of silk. I like to think of evenings here as peaceful, in a way the rest of the palace rarely was. The kitchens buzzed, the courtyards bustled, but by the garden wall the world seemed to move at the pace of a wagging tail. The air smelled faintly of pine from the wooden beams and of earth freshly turned in the nearby herb beds. Once in a while the kennel master would sit among them, a basket of mending at his side, patching a worn blanket or retying the straw mats inside the dog houses. A few of the bolder dogs would rest their heads on his lap as he worked, sighing in that deep, contented way that made the whole world feel slow and safe. Night would come gently here. The lanterns in the palace gardens would be lit, their warm light flickering against the kennel walls. The dogs would curl into their beds, and somewhere in the distance the first night insects would begin their chorus. Even the faint hum of the kitchens would fade, leaving only the whisper of wind against the wall and the steady heartbeat of the palace at rest. And it's in that stillness, with the kennels bathed in soft lantern glow, that we can drift onward, toward a day in the life of one particular palace dog, from morning bell to moonrise. The morning begins before the palace truly wakes. A bell sounds in the distance, not loud or urgent but steady, marking the hour before dawn. The air is cool, touched with the faint smell of dew settling on the grass by the garden wall. In his kennel, Dalbit, the pale-furred dog named for the moonlight, stirs. His ears flick once, twice, then he rises, stepping onto the packed earth path outside. The sky is still ink-dark in the west, but in the east a thin line of silver is forming, just enough to outline the tiled rooftops. From the kitchens, faint clinks and low voices can already be heard, the earliest cooks beginning their preparations. Dalbit knows this sound as well as he knows his own heartbeat. His tail gives a slow wag. The kennel master arrives soon after, carrying a glazed bowl of water that catches the dim light, and a small tray with Dalbit's portion of food, a mix of steamed barley and finely chopped vegetables, with the occasional morsel of fish or beef broth to keep the nose interested. Dalbit eats slowly, never rushing. He learned long ago that a palace dog does not gulp. Once his paws are wiped clean, Dalbit trots beside the kennel master through the garden gate and into the narrow service corridor that leads toward the kitchens. Here, the smells begin to change. The cool scent of earth and pine is replaced by the warmth of roasting grains, the sharpness of chopped scallions, and the faint salt tang of fish laid out for the morning's inspection. Dalbit's first task is always the same. He sits by the door as the first deliveries arrive from the market. Woven baskets of greens, clay jars of sauces, and bundles of dried roots are set down on a long wooden table. Dalbit waits patiently until the head cook gestures to him. Then, one by one, he steps forward to sniff each item. His nose lingers on the spinach just long enough to confirm its freshness. He turns his head slightly away from a jar that has the faintest hint of sourness, alerting the cooks to check it more closely. When this work is done, Dalbit retreats to his favoured spot near the great hearth. From here, he can keep an eye on the whole kitchen. The room is alive now, knives tapping rhythmically against cutting boards, ladles stirring thick broths, the soft swish of silk sleeves as kitchen assistants move between stations. Dalbit takes it all in, his head resting on his paws but his eyes open, following the flow of the day. Around mid-morning, a young apprentice cook drops a slice of radish. It rolls across the floor, stopping just in front of Dalbit's nose. He sniffs at it, then looks up at the boy without touching it. The boy smiles and retrieves it. Palace dogs do not eat without being given. That is one of the first rules they learn. Later, as the stews bubble and the rice steams, Dalbit makes his second inspection, this time of the ready dishes. He moves slowly, almost ceremonially, alongside the head cook, checking the air above each platter. A faint wag means the dish is balanced. A stiffening of the ears might suggest something amiss. Today, all is well. By midday, the kitchen's quiet just slightly, the great rush of preparation over. Dalbit stretches in the patch of sunlight that spills across the floor, letting the warmth sink into his fur. He dozes, half listening to the muted voices outside as trays are carried away toward the royal dining rooms. In the afternoon, there is smaller work to be done, checking stores of dried goods, ensuring the grain jars are tightly sealed, and making a brief round to the garden where fresh herbs grow. Dalbit follows the head cook there, sniffing at the mint, the chives, and the perilla leaves. The breeze carries the scent of blossoms from the far side of the wall, mixing with the earthiness of the herbs until the air feels heavy with quiet luxury. When the evening meal approaches, Dalbit returns to the hearth once more. The light outside softens into gold, then fades to dusk. Lanterns are lit, their glow flickering on the polished floor. The final dishes of the day are prepared, inspected, and carried away. Dalbit's tail thumps softly when the last tray leaves, his work for the day complete. After his own supper, he walks back to the kennels with the master. The path is cool now, the grass damp under his paws. In the distance, the palace hums with low evening voices, but here, by the garden wall, the world is still. Dalbit curls into his bed, tucking his nose against his side. Somewhere in the distance, a nightbird calls. The moon rises, casting its pale light over the kennels. And Dalbit, the moonlight dog, drifts into sleep. Tomorrow will come with new scents to read, new dishes to guard, and the same quiet rhythm he has always known. And now, as the moon watches over the kennels, let us wander into a different kind of palace memory, one that tells of a feast so grand, even the dogs seem to sense its importance. It begins with a sound, not the quiet chop of a single kitchen knife, but the rolling percussion of dozens. The palace is alive with anticipation. Courtyards echo with hurried footsteps, corridors hum with the shuffle of silk robes, and from every kitchen door comes the rising song of preparation. Today is no ordinary day. It is a day of great celebration, a royal feast that will bring together ministers, scholars, envoys, and, of course, the king himself. The kitchens have been awake since the blackest hours before dawn. Fires were lit when the moon still hung high, and cauldrons of broth have been simmering ever since. Every station is filled, one corner for meats, another for fish, another for vegetables, and yet another for the delicate work of sweets. The air is layered with scent upon scent, the smoky perfume of grilled eel, the clean brine of fresh oysters, the deep earthy weight of mushrooms braised in soy. And there, moving through it all with calm authority, is the head cook, and at his side the palace's most senior dog. His fur is the colour of burnished gold, his eyes sharp despite his age. He has walked beside this cook through many feasts, and he knows the rhythm well, the careful checking of ingredients, the subtle nod when all is as it should be. For this feast, the number of dishes is staggering, more than 100 in total, arranged according to the strict rules of royal dining. Records from the 18th century describe such banquets in meticulous detail. Multiple courses of soup, grilled meats, steamed fish, pickled vegetables, rice and rice cakes, each one prepared with precision and served in a particular order. The dog weaves between tables and cooking fires, pausing when the head cook does. A tray of boiled chicken, its skin pale and glossy, passes inspection. A platter of steamed dumplings, delicate as silk purses, earns a slow wag. A pot of fish stew causes the dog to lower his head and sniff longer, not in disapproval, but in deep consideration. The cook makes a small adjustment, adding a few sprigs of fresh chive, and the dog's ears relax. The palace's younger cooks glance at the animal with a mix of respect and awe. They've grown up hearing stories of his nose, how he once detected a batch of sesame oil gone rancid just by passing the storage room door, or how he refused to approach a jar of kimchi that had been stored too near a smoky fire, knowing the flavour would be off. As the afternoon wears on, the dishes are completed one by one and moved to the great serving hall. There, servants in formal dress arrange them in symmetrical patterns, porcelain bowls and lacquered trays gleaming under the lantern light. The feast is not just about taste. It is a work of art, a reflection of the kingdom's prosperity, and the court's refinement. The dog's work ends at the kitchen threshold. He does not enter the hall. Instead, he sits by the open door, listening to the distant murmur of voices as the guests take their places. From where he rests, the scents of the feast drift out, bright and fresh at first, then softer as the dishes are served and the evening deepens. It is said that on nights like this, the palace dogs were given a special meal of their own. Not the leftovers from the feast, but carefully prepared portions, plain-boiled meats, rice and broth, served in their own bowls, so they too could share in the celebration in a manner fitting their station. And so, under the rising glow of the moon, the kennels fill with the gentle sounds of satisfied dogs settling into the grass, bellies full, eyes heavy. The palace quiets by degrees, the laughter from the feast fading into the cool night air. Somewhere beyond the walls the city still hums, but here, in the heart of the palace, the night belongs to the slow breath of the gardens, the flicker of lanterns, and the steady companionship between a cook and his golden-furred guardian. And as that guardian closes his eyes, let us wander toward another tale, of a journey beyond the palace gates, and the surprising role the royal kitchen dogs once played on the road. The palace is a place of routine, but every so often the rhythm changes. In the cool days of early autumn, when the air carries the faint spice of fallen leaves, and the mornings are wrapped in a soft mist, the king would leave the capital for the royal hunt. These expeditions were more than sport. They were displays of skill, leadership, and unity between the monarch and his court. They were also logistical marvels, moving dozens of attendants, guards, cooks, and supplies into the countryside. And among those supplies, a small but essential contingent from the royal kitchens, which, on rare occasions, included one or two of the palace dogs. The hunt was not simply about chasing game. It was also about feasting in the open air, with dishes worthy of the royal table, and so the same rules of care and quality followed the king wherever he went. The morning they set out, the palace courtyard is alive with motion. Horses stamp their hooves, servants load carts with chests of porcelain and jars of seasoning, and guards adjust their bows and quivers. Near the kitchen wagons, a young dog, not yet as seasoned as Dalbit or the golden hound from the feasts, waits, ears pricked, tail held low but wagging gently. This is his first journey beyond the palace walls. He wears no harness, no lead, only the invisible tether of training and loyalty. At his side is an older kitchen attendant who knows the road well. They set off in the cool dawn, the palace shrinking behind them until its tiled roofs are just a memory against the brightening sky. The road winds through villages and fields. Farmers pause in their work to watch the royal procession pass, bowing deeply. Children whisper to one another, pointing at the fine horses, the tall guards, and perhaps with the most curiosity, the pale-furred dog trotting calmly between the wheels of the kitchen cart. By midday they reach a small camp already prepared by advanced servants. Here, under tall pines whose needles carpet the ground, the royal tents are set in neat rows. The kitchen has its own space, a large canvas awning stretched over tables and stoves brought from the palace. The dog explores the perimeter, nose twitching at the unfamiliar scents of wild grass, pine resin, and distant wood smoke. Cooking for the hunt is different from cooking in the palace. The ingredients are fewer, the tools simpler, but the expectation is just as high. Game birds are plucked and dressed, fish caught from nearby streams are cleaned, and rice is steamed in heavy pots over open flames. The dog, as always, moves among the work, his senses sharp for anything amiss. That evening, when the hunters return with their catch, the camp comes alive again. The air fills with the sizzling of meat over coals, the snap of pine branches feeding the fire, and the low hum of voices as stories from the day are traded. The king dines under the open sky, the stars pricking through the darkness above, the air crisp with the first hints of frost. The dog sits just outside the circle of light from the campfires, watchful but calm. He has inspected the food, guarded the supplies, and now, with his work done, he settles into the quiet sounds of the forest. A wind moves through the pines with a long, soft sigh, and the distant call of an owl marks the hour. The next morning, they will return to the hunt and in a few days to the palace, But for now, the world is small and simple. Firelight, cool night air, the steady rhythm of breath, and the scent of pine all around. And as the dog drifts into sleep, the fire crackling low beside him, we can follow the wind back toward the palace. To a winter's day when the kitchens prepared something so warming, it became the stuff of quiet legend among the dogs. The palace winters could be sharp enough to bite. Cold winds swept down from the mountains, rattling the paper windows and setting the pine trees creaking in the courtyards. Even the kitchens, with their great hearths and cauldrons, felt the chill in the early morning before the fires caught and spread their warmth. It was on such a morning, the kind where your breath hangs in the air like a slow cloud, that the royal kitchen prepared one of its most comforting winter dishes, galbitang, a clear soup made from beef short ribs, simple in its appearance but rich in its depth. It was a dish meant to warm the bones and soften the day. The process began before sunrise. Large iron pots were filled with water, and the ribs, carefully cleaned, were placed inside to simmer slowly, releasing their flavour over hours. The scent that filled the room was gentle at first, almost shy, but grew stronger as the morning deepened, drawing even the sleepiest kitchen workers closer to the hearth. And of course, near that hearth, stretched out on a thick straw mat, was one of the palace dogs, a broad-shouldered, white-coated elder whose muzzle had begun to show the faint silver of age. His job today, as always, was to guard the heart of the kitchen, but in winter there was an unspoken agreement. The warmth of the galbitang pot was as much for him as it was for the meal. As the broth simmered, Cook skimmed it carefully, removing any foam so the soup would stay clear. Garlic cloves, sliced radish, and green onions joined the pot, their aromas weaving together like threads in a winter scarf. The dog sniffed each new addition as it passed by, not moving from his post but letting his eyes follow the cook's hands. There's an old palace anecdote, somewhere in the 18th century household notes, about a winter when the soup was almost spoiled. A shipment of radishes had arrived late, and some were beginning to turn. It was the palace hound who caught it, turning his head sharply away when the first of the suspect radishes was brought near the pot. The cooks replaced them immediately, and the soup was saved. The note ends with a simple line: "The hound spared His Majesty an unpleasant bowl." By midday, the galbitang was ready. The broth shimmered in the light, steam curling upward into the cold air. The ribs were tender enough to fall apart with the slightest touch of chopsticks. Bowls were prepared for the royal table, porcelain so fine you could see the shadow of the broth through it. Once the dishes were carried out, the kitchen quieted. In that hush, the dog lifted his head to watch as the head cook ladled a smaller portion into a sturdy earthenware bowl. It was placed on the floor beside him, the broth cooled just enough for safe sipping. This was his reward, not as rich as the king's serving, but warm, fragrant, and shared with respect. Outside, snow had begun to fall, each flake drifting lazily into the courtyard. The garden was turning white by the time the dog finished his bowl, licking it clean with slow, satisfied strokes. He lay back down, the heat of the meal spreading through him until even the winter wind seemed far away. Some nights I imagine him dreaming of that broth, its quiet depth, the way it filled the kitchen with a promise of comfort. A winter's day could be long and cold, but with a pot of galbitang and a good dog on watch, the palace would always feel warm. And as the snow falls deeper in our story, let's follow its trail into another corner of palace life. One filled with sweet aromas, soft textures, and a treat that even the kitchen dogs would stop to notice. If the main kitchens were the beating heart of the palace, then the rice cake room was its quiet sigh. Tucked away down a narrow corridor, past storerooms lined with clay jars and bundles of dried herbs, this was a place of delicate work. No roaring fires or sizzling pans here. Instead, the air was thick with the gentle perfume of steaming rice and the faint floral notes of garnishes waiting in little bowls. The room was warm, not from flames, but from the great wooden steamers stacked over gently bubbling pots. The steam carried a softness that wrapped around anyone who entered, easing the winter chill from their bones. And yes, the palace dogs knew this room well. Today, a grey and cream hound named Sori lies just inside the doorway, her tail curled neatly around her paws. She's not here to beg, she never does, but to observe, and perhaps to offer her silent inspection of the ingredients as they pass. The rice flour is fine as silk, milled to perfection. The honey glistens in its jar like amber caught in sunlight. A plate of pine nuts rests nearby, their pale gold shells waiting to be split and set atop the finished cakes. The work here is slow and methodical. The rice flour is mixed with water, kneaded until it feels like soft clay under the hands, then pressed into molds carved with flowers, birds, and swirling clouds. When the cakes are steamed, those patterns will emerge like frost on glass. Some are left plain and snowy white. Others are tinted pale green with mugwort or blushed pink with strawberry syrup. Sori watches all of this with half-closed eyes, her ears flicking whenever the cooks laugh or murmur to one another. Every so often, a small puff of fragrant steam drifts toward her, and her nose twitches. She can tell which batches are perfectly balanced and which have too much syrup, a skill the rice cake makers respect. Once, during the previous year's harvest festival, she turned her head away from a batch that smelled slightly off, saving the kitchen from sending imperfect cakes to the royal table. The rice cake room is different from the bustle of the main kitchen. Here, there's time for quiet conversation, for the careful placing of a single candied jujube slice on top of a fresh TTT oak. The light comes through high paper windows, scattering soft patterns across the floor. Dust motes drift lazily in the beams, looking like tiny flakes of rice flour suspended in the air. When the first tray of finished cakes emerges from the steamer, the scent is almost hypnotic. Sweet, clean, comforting. The cook set them on low racks to cool, the steam rising in ghostly ribbons. Sori shifts slightly closer, her paws silent on the polished floor, and gives a slow wag of approval. The best cakes will be served with tea in the king's private quarters that evening, a quiet indulgence after the formal meal. A smaller selection will go to visiting scholars or favoured guests. And just before the trays leave, one cake, always one, will be set aside for the palace dogs. Not every day, not even every week, but enough that the dogs understand the ritual. Today, the chosen cake is plain white, pressed with the image of a chrysanthemum. It's broken into small pieces, cooled and shared among those on duty. Sori receives her portion with the same calm dignity she brings to her work. She eats slowly, savouring the faint sweetness and the soft chew, her eyes half closed in quiet contentment. Outside, the afternoon light is already fading, shadows stretching long across the courtyard. The rice cake room will work late tonight, preparing for tomorrow's offerings. But for now, there is only the hum of quiet voices, the soft hiss of steam, and the steady heartbeat of the palace that never truly sleeps. And as the sweet steam fades from our minds, we can step into another chamber, one where fire and spice rule the air, and the royal kitchen dogs keep watch over something far more daring. There was a part of the palace kitchens that felt like stepping into another world entirely. A world where the air itself tingled against your skin and made your breath catch just a little. This was the pepper room. It wasn't large, but the scent hit you the moment you stepped inside. Crushed red chili, freshly ground black pepper, fermented pastes rich with heat. All of it lived here, in rows of clay jars and bundles hung to dry along the rafters. The cooks who worked this room were specialists. Their hands moved with the confidence of people who knew exactly how much spice could elevate a dish, and how much could overwhelm it. The royal kitchen dogs treated this room with a different sort of respect. Most would pause at the doorway, sniffing the air before deciding whether to enter. On this day, the role of watchful companion belonged to a young, amber-eyed dog named Gayul, Autumn in the palace tongue, whose curiosity often outpaced his caution. Goal followed the head spice cook inside, his nose twitching wildly. He sneezed once, a quick, surprised sound, then settled near the far wall where the air was a little gentler. From here, he could watch the work without interrupting it. On the main table, bright red chili peppers were spread out to be sorted. Some had the deep crimson hue that promised warmth without overpowering, while others, smaller and darker, carried a sharper bite. Beside them sat small sacks of peppercorns, their aroma bright and almost floral. Each batch would be inspected, cleaned, and either dried for storage or ground into powders and pastes. Pepper and spice weren't just about flavour. In the palace, they were also about preservation, balance, and even symbolism. Red chili, for example, was believed to have protective qualities, warding off illness during certain seasons. And so a room like this was as important to the royal kitchens as the great stew pots or rice steamers. Ghoul's task here was quiet but vital. Detect anything that didn't belong. A jar of gochujang that had fermented too far, a bag of peppercorns that had picked up the faint must of damp storage. These things might escape a hurried human nose, but never his. At one point, the spice cook handed him a small open sack to inspect. Ghoul leaned forward, inhaled deeply, and then pulled back, blinking. The pepper was fine, strong, yes, but bright and clean. His tail gave a single thump of approval on the floorboards. The day's work in the pepper room was rhythmic. Peppers were crushed between heavy stone mortars, their seeds releasing bursts of heat into the air. Paste was stirred in deep bowls, the wooden paddles making soft, wet sounds against the clay. At intervals, the door was propped open to let the spiced air drift out into the courtyard, where it mixed with the cooler breezes of autumn. When the work was done, the jars were sealed with paper and twine marked with their preparation date and carried to the storage hall. Ghoul trotted behind them, his head high, as if escorting something precious. And in truth, he was. In the right hands, these spices would weave their way into soups, marinades, and dipping sauces, becoming the subtle fire at the heart of 100 palace meals. That evening, after the last jars were stacked neatly in their rows, the spice cook crouched down and scratched behind Ghoul's ears. "Good work," he murmured. From his pocket he produced a tiny morsel of plain boiled beef. A small thank you. Ghoul accepted it with careful grace, chewing slowly as the lantern light warmed the room. Outside, the night had taken hold. The pepper room's scent still clung to the air, a faint heat lingering even in the cool dark. And as Ghoul padded back toward the kennels, the palace seemed to breathe in the comfort of knowing its flavours were safe. And from the fire and spice of this chamber, our path will lead us next into a quieter, humbler space, one where the royal kitchen dogs guarded something even more precious than food. The pantry was not grand like the feast hall, nor lively like the main kitchen. It was a place of stillness, lined with shelves that seemed to hold the very heartbeat of the palace's meals. Here the light was always soft, filtered through narrow windows, and the air carried the earthy perfume of stored grain, dried herbs, and carefully sealed jars. Unlike the kitchens, which bustled from before dawn to long after dusk, the pantry moved in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Every item had its place. Rice jars stood in precise rows, their lids sealed against moisture. Bundles of dried kelp hung from the rafters. Wooden boxes held persimmons, pears, and jujubes carefully wrapped to keep them fresh. It was in this pantry that a dog named Hoikdol made his quiet rounds. His coat was dark as ink, broken only by a splash of white across his chest, and his eyes missed nothing. Hoikdol had served the palace for years, and the pantry was his domain. Each morning, before the cooks began their work, he walked the narrow paths between shelves, his nose hovering just above the lids and wrappings. He was not looking for thieves, though he would have sounded the alarm if one appeared, but for change, a hint of dampness in the rice jars, a sour note in the air near the dried beans, the faint musk of a mouse daring to enter the king's stores. In the autumn of 1725, a pantry record notes that a small sack of millet was found to have spoiled early. The reason given, detected by the hound of the stores. That was Hoikdol, doing what no human nose could, catching the trouble before it spread. On this day in our story, the pantry is cool and orderly. The shelves are freshly swept, the jars polished. A few assistants move quietly through the space, making notes on wooden tally boards. Every so often, one will glance down and nod at Hoikdol, as if acknowledging an equal partner in the work. He pauses by a stack of woven baskets filled with chestnuts, their shells smooth and dark. Satisfied, he moves on, tail swaying slowly. The air is calm here, touched only by the faint crackle of the fire from the adjoining kitchen and the distant calls from the courtyard. There's a kind of peace in this place. The pantry is not where the food is transformed. It is where it rests, where it waits to become something greater. And in that waiting there is a trust that nothing will be lost, spoiled, or stolen. When the morning inspection is complete, Hoikdol settles at the doorway, a spot where he can see both the pantry shelves and the hallway beyond. From here, he dozes lightly, waking whenever someone enters to fetch ingredients. Each face is familiar, each step is measured. By late afternoon, the pantry will be quieter still, most of the day's ingredients already in use. The shadows stretch longer between the shelves, and the golden light catches the dust motes in the air. Hoikdol's breathing slows. In a few hours he'll be called back to the kennels for the night, but for now, this is his place. Quiet, steady, and essential. And so, as we leave Hoikdol in the calm of the pantry, our path will turn toward another corner of the palace. One filled not with stores or spices, but with the music of running water and the scent of fresh herbs. On the far edge of the palace grounds, beyond the kennels and the busy kitchens, there was a small garden that seemed to breathe differently from the rest of the royal compound. Here the air was always fresher, touched with the clean green scent of leaves. A narrow stream curved along its edge, fed by an underground spring, its water clear enough to see pebbles glinting on the bottom. This was the herb garden, a place where flavour began long before it reached the king's table. Rows of perilla leaves stood in gentle ranks, their broad green faces catching the light. Clumps of fragrant mint grew near the water's edge. Ginseng roots rested beneath carefully turned soil, their leaves trembling in the slightest breeze. And as in all important corners of the palace's food world, a dog kept watch here. Her name was Churong, meaning small lantern, for the pale ring of fur that circled her neck. She was light on her feet and quick to notice anything amiss. Churong's days in the herb garden began early. Before the gardeners arrived, she would walk the narrow paths between rows, her nose brushing the tops of the plants. She could tell which leaves had soaked in too much rain, which bunches of thyme were just reaching their peak, and whether a stray insect had dared to nibble at the tender sprouts. The gardeners loved her for this. If she paused too long at a plant, they knew to check it. Sometimes she'd guide them to a patch of soil that smelled wrong, too wet, too sour, leading them to replant before the roots suffered. This morning in our story, the garden is washed in the soft gold of early sunlight. Dew clings to the perilla leaves, making them sparkle. The stream murmurs quietly, a low, steady song. The air carries a mix of scents, the sharpness of chives, the cool lift of mint, and faintly, the sweet earthiness of freshly dug ginseng. Churong moves with unhurried grace. She stops near the mint and takes in a long, slow breath, her tail giving a single wag of approval. She steps past the chives, her head tilting slightly as if listening to something only she can hear. The rustle of a beetle beneath the soil, perhaps. There's a quiet beauty to this garden that the main kitchen never has. No rush, no clatter, no rising clouds of smoke. Just sunlight, water, and the slow work of growth. Yet everything here will find its way into the palace dishes. A sprig of mint in a cool summer drink, a handful of perilla leaves in a fresh wrap, a sliver of ginseng in a medicinal broth. By midday, the gardeners have gathered what they need, filling woven baskets with herbs and roots. Churong trots behind them as they carry the harvest back toward the kitchens, her work done for the moment. She will return in the afternoon to patrol again, making sure no stray cat or curious bird has disturbed the beds. As the baskets disappear through the kitchen doors, the garden returns to its stillness. The stream keeps singing its low song, the leaves sway gently, and somewhere in the distance a bell chimes the passing of the hour, and from this peaceful place of beginnings, we can step next into a more ceremonial chamber. One where the royal kitchen dogs watched over food not for daily meals, but for offerings meant to honour the ancestors. There was a part of the palace that felt more like a temple than the kitchen. It stood apart from the everyday bustle of cooking, quiet and reverent, its air filled with the faint sweetness of incense and the slow rhythm of careful hands at work. This was the hall where food was prepared for ancestral rites. solemn offerings to honour the kings and queens who had passed before. Inside, long tables of polished wood were set with precision. Every dish had its appointed place, and every placement carried meaning. Bowls of rice gleamed white and perfect. Fish lay whole, their silver skin brushed until it shone. Plates of fruit, pears, persimmons, jujubes were arranged in pyramids so neat they seemed carved from a single block. Here the dog's role was not just practical, it was almost symbolic. A single older hound named Myong kept his post near the entrance. His fur was a mottled mix of brown and cream, and his eyes were calm, almost solemn, as though he understood the weight of the occasion. Myong did what the palace dogs always did. He guarded the food from anything that might spoil or taint it. But he also guarded the stillness, watching quietly as the cooks moved with a kind of slow choreography. No rushing, no clattering, only the soft shuffle of feet and the gentle placement of bowls and trays. The food for these rites was prepared with the same care as the king's own meals, sometimes even more so. The records of 1756 mention an offering table where the fish was chosen for its clear eyes and bright scales, and the rice was sifted 7 times. Myong would have been there for such a day, his nose testing the air as each item was brought into the hall. On this morning, the scent is layered but restrained. Clean rice, lightly grilled meat, fresh fruit, and the faint floral note of incense smoke drifting from the altar. Myong moves only when the head cook gestures, stepping forward to inspect a tray before it's set in its place. A single flick of his tail is enough to send the cook's face into a small relieved smile. When the table is complete, it is a picture of order and abundance. The offerings are not eaten in the hall. They are placed, bowed to, and left for a time in silence. Myong remains at his post, eyes half closed but alert as the ceremony unfolds. Later, when the rites are finished and the offerings are carried away, some of the food will be shared among the palace staff. A few plain morsels, always plain without the heavy seasonings, will make their way to the kennels, a quiet acknowledgement of the dog's unseen service. As the last traces of incense fade, the hall empties. The polished tables stand bare once more, ready for the next occasion. Myong steps outside into the courtyard light, stretches slowly, and follows the head cook back toward the kitchens. The ceremony is over, but the palace's daily work waits, and from this solemn space our path will next lead to one of warmth and celebration. The kitchens as they come alive during the Lunar New Year, and the scents that the royal kitchen dogs could never forget. The palace always felt different on the morning of the Lunar New Year. Even before the first bell of the day, the air seemed to hum with a gentle excitement. Lanterns hung from the eaves, their red silk glowing softly against the pale winter sky. The courtyards were swept spotless, and a faint scent of pine and tangerine peel drifted on the breeze from offerings already set out at the gates. Inside the kitchens, the day began well before dawn. Fires crackled to life in every hearth, the orange light catching on the polished copper pots and the smooth curves of porcelain bowls stacked neatly on the shelves. Today's work was not just about the king's table, it was about abundance, luck, and the joy of beginnings. 2 palace dogs had the honour of joining the kitchens this morning. Dalbit, the pale-furred elder, took his place near the main hearth. Beside him sat Gayul, the amber-eyed younger dog whose curiosity often brought him just a step closer to the action than was strictly necessary. Both wore simple collars braided with red silk ribbon, a sign of celebration. The scents came in waves. First, the deep, comforting smell of simmering teokguk, sliced rice cake soup, the traditional first meal of the year. The broth was rich with beef and green onion, the rice cakes tender and chewy. Then came the sharper, playful notes of Jean, savoury pancakes studded with vegetables, seafood or meat, frying gently in shallow pans. The air carried a quiet sizzle that seemed to echo the crackle of the fires. As the morning went on, the tables filled with more dishes, japchae noodles glistening with sesame oil, stacks of honeyed yakwa cookies, bowls of bright kimchi, and platters of steamed dumplings. Everything was made in generous quantities, not just for the royal household, but to be shared with visiting ministers, scholars, and even certain honoured servants. The dogs moved carefully between the cooks, their tails swaying in time with the rhythm of the work. Dalbit's roll was steady and deliberate, pausing to sniff the trays before they were carried to the king's table. Goal's nose darted here and there, his interest caught by the sweet sesame scent of yakwa one moment and the savoury warmth of the rice cake soup the next. In one corner, a small table had been set aside for the staff's New Year meal. When the main cooking was done, a portion of each dish was placed there, and the kitchen workers sat together in shifts to eat. A small bowl of teokguk was set on the floor near the hearth, plain, without heavy seasoning, and shared between Dalbit and Gayul. The warmth of the broth seemed to melt the winter from their bones. By afternoon, the palace was alive with visiting guests, gifts being exchanged, and the laughter of children running across the courtyards in their bright hanbok. The kitchen stayed busy, but the air held a kind of lightness that only came once a year. As evening fell, the last trays were sent out and the cooks began to bank the fires. Dalbit and Ghoul followed the kennel master back through the lantern-lit corridors. The snow in the gardens reflected the red glow of the lanterns, and the air was still, as if holding the moment in place. In the kennels, the dogs curled into their beds, the faint scent of teokguk still lingering in their fur. Outside, a final firework bloomed quietly over the palace walls, scattering sparks into the winter sky. And from this night of warmth and plenty, we can wander next into the quieter season that followed, when the palace dogs kept watch over food stores that had to last until spring. After the brightness and bustle of the Lunar New Year, the palace seemed to draw inward. The days were short, the sun a pale guest in the sky, and the gardens lay bare under a thin veil of frost. In this quiet season, the kitchens shifted their work, less about daily abundance, more about careful keeping. The palace dogs knew this time well. It was the season when the storerooms became the heart of the kitchens, and every jar, sack and barrel mattered. The food gathered in autumn and early winter had to last until the first green shoots of spring, and the dogs' noses were as important as the head cook's judgment. Dalbit was often chosen for these winter inspections. His pace was slow, deliberate, his head turning just enough to scent the air between the shelves. The rice jars stood heavy and silent, their lids sealed with paper and string. Clay crocks of soy sauce and doenjang rested against the cool stone walls. Bundles of dried kelp hung from the beams, swaying slightly in the draught from the door. It was a season of small discoveries, a hint of damp where none should be, traced to a loose paper seal on a jar of beans, the faint sharp tang of vinegar where the rice wine had begun to turn. Even the quiet scratching of a mouse in the rafters would draw Dalbit's gaze upward, ears pricked until the problem was dealt with. The storerooms had their own winter music, the creak of wooden shelves under the weight of grain, the low pop of clay lids adjusting to the cold, the muffled steps of assistants carrying baskets of supplies to the kitchen. Outside, snow sometimes fell in slow, lazy flakes, drifting against the small windows and dimming the light even further. For the palace dogs, winter was a time of endurance as much as service. The cold crept into their fur when they walked between buildings, and the stone floors bit at their paws. But the kitchen fires always welcomed them back, their warmth seeping into bones and softening the long days. There's a record from 1691 describing how the hounds of the palace were given straw bedding and warm broth during the coldest weeks. It's easy to picture Dalbit on such a night, lying on his mat near the hearth, the scent of simmering broth curling through the air while snow taps gently against the paper windows. In the stillness of this season, there was also a kind of closeness. Fewer visitors meant fewer distractions, and the kitchen workers seemed to move with a quieter camaraderie. The dogs, too, shared the warmth of each other's company, curling close in the kennels when the wind howled across the palace roofs. The work never stopped, but in winter it slowed just enough to notice the sound of the soup bubbling, the way the soy jars seemed to deepen their aroma in the cold, the soft thump of a dog's tail when the head cook passed by. And so the palace waited for spring, its stores guarded, its kitchen steady, and its dogs keeping watch over the quiet treasure of survival. From this hush of winter, we'll next step into a season of return, when the first greens appear and the kitchens open their doors to the scents of early spring. The first sign wasn't the flowers. It was the faint change in the air, a breath of warmth curling through the palace corridors, carrying with it the scent of damp earth. The snow melted away in slow patches, and in the gardens tiny shoots began to push through the soil, their green tips catching the pale spring sunlight. In the kitchens, this change was met with quiet anticipation. After months of relying on stored grains, dried vegetables, and preserved sauces, the arrival of fresh greens was like a note of music breaking the stillness. And the palace dogs, though they did not eat these herbs and shoots themselves, recognized the shift. The scents were sharper now, brighter, full of the promise of the new meals to guard. Shirong, the light-footed small lantern of the herb garden, was the first to patrol the early harvest. She moved between the beds where spring onions leaned in the breeze, where the first Napa cabbage leaves unfurled in pale curls, and where wild dropwort clustered near the edges of the garden paths. Her paws made no sound on the damp soil. The gardeners worked carefully, knowing these first greens were tender and few. Each bunch was lifted with care, shaken gently to release loose soil, and placed into low baskets. Shirong sniffed each one as it passed, her nose confirming what her eyes already seemed to know: the freshness, the absence of damage, the faint peppery bite that marked a plant ready for the royal table. In the main kitchen, the baskets arrived like treasures. Spring onion stems were sliced thin, their scent filling the room with a crisp, clean energy. Cabbage leaves were blanched and dressed lightly in sesame oil. Some greens would be folded into delicate pancakes. Others would garnish the clear broths that had sustained the palace through winter. Dalbit, older now but still steady, lay near the hearth as the first spring soup simmered. It was a simple broth: beef bones, a handful of dropwort, and a scattering of garlic chives, but it filled the kitchen with a fragrance so fresh it almost seemed to hum in the air. Dalbit raised his head when the cook brought the ladle near, sniffing the steam before resting his head back on his paws in quiet approval. And there is an old entry from the 18th century kitchen accounts describing the joy of the first greens, noting that they were always served on a day when the king and court could dine together in ease. It was less about abundance and more about the shared pleasure of renewal, a reminder that winter had passed and the world was alive again. By afternoon, the kitchens had prepared small dishes for the palace staff as well, a rare gesture for a rare day. Shirong received a small treat too, a bit of boiled chicken wrapped in a tender cabbage leaf, placed carefully on the stone path by her favourite sunlit corner. She ate it slowly, watching the gardeners plant the next rows for summer. As evening fell, the air carried both the softness of spring and the faint scent of smoke from the last of the day's cooking fires. The dogs settled into their kennels with bellies full and ears tuned to the gentle rustle of new leaves outside the walls. And from this season of renewal, we'll move to a time of plenty, when the palace kitchens faced the lively chaos of the summer markets, and the dogs' noses had more work than ever. Summer arrived in the palace not as a gentle visitor, but as a bright, insistent guest. The air shimmered above the rooftops, and the smell of warm stone mixed with the heavier scents of ripening fruit and sun-dried goods. Inside the kitchens, the pace quickened. Heat meant the ingredients had to be fresher, the inspections sharper, and the dog's work more constant. Ghoul, the amber-eyed dog with the restless curiosity, loved the summer market days. He didn't often go, but when he did, his tail swayed in an eager rhythm from the moment the head cook picked up the market basket. The streets outside the palace walls in midsummer were alive with sound. Vendors calling, wooden carts rumbling, the soft slap of fishmongers rinsing their wares in buckets of cool water. The smells were almost overwhelming. Sweet melons, their scent thick and honeyed. The salty mineral tang of freshly caught mackerel laid out on crushed ice. The grassy sharpness of cucumbers stacked in neat pyramids. Ghoul's head moved constantly, drawing in the layers of aroma like a reader turning the pages of a familiar book. The head cook's path through the market was steady, practiced. He knew which stalls had the best sesame oil, which fishmongers handled their catch with care, which fruit sellers were honest about ripeness. Gayul was the silent second opinion. A brief pause at a barrel of shrimp paste, sniff, blink, tail flick, approval, a wrinkle of the nose at a basket of green beans, a little too far gone in the heat, and the cook moved on without a word. Summer markets were also lively with travellers. Some stalls offered spices from distant provinces, or sweets wrapped in paper printed with unfamiliar characters. Ghoul seemed to sense the difference, sniffing longer at these foreign goods, learning their scents the way another dog might learn the winding paths of the palace grounds. By mid-morning the baskets were full, glossy eggplants, fragrant perilla leaves, jars of fresh doenjang and bundles of thin noodles. The cook balanced them easily, and Ghoul trotted beside him through the sunlit streets, the hum of the market slowly fading behind them. Back in the palace, the summer air in the kitchen was thick with steam and spice. Cooling dishes were prepared first, mulnaengmyeon, cold buckwheat noodles in a light, tangy broth, garnished with sliced cucumber and pear. Ghoul sat near the open window where a breeze occasionally pushed through, his nose lifting to catch the scent of the broth. Heat meant speed in the kitchen. Fish had to be cleaned and cooked almost immediately, fruits sliced and served before their sweetness faded. The dogs' noses became early warning bells, a faint shift in the smell of stored shrimp paste, a suggestion that a basket of herbs might have sat in the sun too long. By evening, when the palace's summer feast was carried out, the kitchens cooled at last. Ghoul received his reward, a small bowl of plain cold noodles, the broth mild but refreshing. He ate in the shade of the kitchen veranda, the last light of the day washing the courtyard in gold. Somewhere beyond the walls the market was closing, its stalls emptying into the quiet streets. But in the palace the scent of summer lingered, bright, fresh and fleeting. And from this season of abundance we'll drift next into a rarer tale, the time a royal kitchen dog found something in the market that changed a recipe forever. It was a morning much like any other market day. The sun already warm on the palace roofs, the kitchen baskets ready, and the head cook walking with his steady, measured pace. Beside him trotted Sori, the grey and cream hound known for her calm eyes and unerring nose. The list for the day was precise. Young radishes, fresh mackerel, sesame seeds and early pears. Nothing unusual. The royal menu was set and every ingredient had its place. But markets have a way of offering surprises to those who pay attention. And sometimes those surprises came to the palace by way of 4 paws and a curious nose. They had just passed the row of herb sellers when Sori slowed, her head turning toward a smaller side street. The cook almost didn't notice, but the gentle tug of her interest made him pause. She stood still, nose working, ears tilting toward the source of an unfamiliar scent. Curiosity won. They stepped down the side lane, where the air was cooler and the noise of the main market faded. There, under the shade of a narrow awning, an old woman sat with a small table of goods, neatly tied bundles of greens unlike anything the cook had seen before. Their leaves were round and slightly waxy, and they carried a scent that was fresh, almost citrus-like, but with a deeper earthy undertone. The old woman called them dolnamul, a wild-growing succulent she'd gathered from the rocky slopes beyond the city. She explained that in her village they were eaten raw, with a light dressing or added to soups at the very end of the cooking. Sori stepped closer, sniffing intently, her tail giving a small approving sway. It was unusual for the palace to buy an unlisted, unfamiliar ingredient, but the cook trusted both his own instincts and the dog's. A small bundle was purchased, wrapped carefully in paper, and placed on top of the day's other goods. Back in the palace kitchens, the dolnamul drew curious looks. The leaves were washed and set aside. That evening they were added as a garnish to a mild fish soup, their brightness lifting the flavour in a way that made even the head cook pause in quiet surprise. The king himself, it was said, asked about the new green in his bowl. After that, the plant found a small but lasting place in the palace gardens, grown in a shaded corner for occasional use. And though it was never a daily staple, it became a favoured garnish for spring soups and early summer salads, all because Sori had paused at the edge of the market and followed her nose. The kitchen dogs, of course, didn't think of it as discovery or innovation. For them, it was simply the work they did, noticing what others might miss, drawing attention to what mattered. But the cooks knew, and every time dolnamul appeared on the chopping board, they remembered the quiet morning when the list changed because a dog had stopped to smell something new. And from this small lane and its quiet stall, we'll next move to a louder, grander scene. A banquet for foreign guests, where the palace dogs guarded flavours meant to travel across cultures and tongues. The palace kitchens were never louder than on the mornings when foreign envoys were to be received. The air itself seemed charged, cooks moving quickly but with care, servants hurrying to and fro with polished trays, the steady crackle of fires layered under the sharper clink of porcelain and metal. Today's menu was to impress not only the king and his court, but men who had travelled from far beyond Joseon's borders, carrying languages and customs unfamiliar to the palace walls. The dishes had been chosen to show both abundance and refinement, a statement in flavours, colours and arrangement. Platters of grilled sea bream gleamed under a light brushing of sesame oil. Towers of rice cakes, some sweet, some savoury, were stacked in patterns meant to resemble blooming flowers. There were dishes of seasoned vegetables, each chosen for balance of colour and texture, and a clear beef broth that the head cook insisted was as much a poem as it is a soup. At the edge of this carefully choreographed work, Dalbit took his post. The pale-furred elder had served through many banquets, and though his pace had slowed, his senses had not dulled. He moved with unhurried certainty, checking trays before they left the kitchen. He had no concern for how a dish looked, only for what it carried in its scent. For these banquets, there was always an extra layer of caution. Some ingredients had come from far provinces, their journey long and sometimes rough. A basket of lychees from the southern coast had been opened that morning. Dalbit's nose confirmed that they were fresh enough to serve, though one or two had to be removed. In the centre of the kitchen, a particularly large dish was being assembled. Sinseolo, the grand hot pot of the palace, its silver brazier polished until it caught every flicker of firelight. Around its rim, neat wedges of beef, mushrooms and vegetables were arranged like the petals of an elaborate flower. In the middle, the broth simmered, releasing a fragrance so rich it seemed to settle in the air like warm silk. Dalbit stood beside the head cook as the final ingredients were placed. His gaze followed the ladle, the steam curling toward his face. A slow, steady blink. Approval. Only then did the cook give the signal for the dish to be carried out. In the banquet hall, the guests would dine under high ceilings and painted beams, their places marked with delicate calligraphy. They would sip broth, taste grilled fish, break the soft chew of rice cakes between their teeth. And through it all, they would be tasting the result of dozens of careful decisions, some of them made by a quiet dog standing in the kitchen doorway. When the last trays left the kitchen, Dalbit returned to his place by the hearth. The heat soaked into his old bones as the muffled sounds of music and conversation drifted back from the hall. A little later, a small bowl of plain broth was set before him, not from the banquet itself, but from the same pot, a silent gesture of inclusion. That night, the banquet was judged a success. The foreign envoys praised the harmony of the flavours, the balance of the table. And though his name was never spoken in their toasts, Dalbit's work had been there in every bite. From this hall of voices and clinking bowls, we'll next step into a quieter story. Of a single afternoon when a palace dog's attention was caught not by food, but by something glinting in the kitchens. It was an ordinary afternoon in the palace kitchens, the kind that sat between the rush of lunch and the slow build toward the evening meal. The air was calm, with only the soft chop of knives and the low hum of conversation from the cooks at their stations. Dalbit, dozing near the warm base of a brick hearth, opened one eye when a faint metallic clink cut through the stillness. A spoon had fallen, not the small kind used for tasting, but one of the heavy, long-handled silver spoons reserved for the king's service. It rolled across the polished floor, coming to rest under a side table where baskets of scallions and radishes were waiting to be trimmed. The young kitchen assistant who had dropped it froze. The king's silverware was not only valuable but symbolic. Every piece was counted, cleaned, and kept in perfect condition. Losing track of one could bring sharp words from the chief steward. Before the boy could move, Dalbit rose. His paws made no sound as he crossed the floor, his nose dipping toward the gap beneath the table. The silver glinted faintly in the shadows. Dalbit's head tilted. Then he crouched slightly, his front paw reaching forward just enough to nudge the spoon into the open. The assistant's eyes widened. good boy," he whispered, scooping it up quickly. He glanced around to see if anyone else had noticed, but the head cook was focused on a simmering pot across the room, and the other assistants were busy at their boards. Only Dalbit knew the spoon had been rescued from the dusty fate of being forgotten. The boy carried it to the washing station, where it was cleaned, polished, and returned to its place. Dalbit returned to his spot by the hearth, curling back into the warm, slightly ashy smell of brick and wood. That afternoon the kitchens went on as if nothing unusual had happened. But for the boy it became a small story to keep. The time the old palace hound quietly prevented what might have been a scolding, or worse. There's no mention of it in the palace records, of course. No line in the kitchen accounts for spoon retrieved by hound. But I like to imagine that for the rest of Dalbit's life, whenever that boy saw him by the hearth, he'd offer a little extra scrap of boiled beef or a brief scratch behind the ears in thanks. And so, from the quiet rescue of a single spoon, our path will take us next to something grander. A summer night feast in the palace gardens, when the dogs walked among lanterns and music. The palace gardens by day were beautiful, but by night, under hundreds of lanterns, they became something else entirely. It was midsummer, and the air was heavy with the scent of lotus flowers blooming on the ponds. A soft breeze carried the faint sweetness of night-blooming jasmine, and from the high branches of the pines came the steady hum of cicadas. Tonight's feast was held outdoors beneath the wide sky. Lanterns of red and gold hung from the eaves, from tree branches, and along the edges of the paths. Their glow shimmered on the polished lacquer tables set low to the ground, each one laid with porcelain bowls, silver chopsticks, and small vases of fresh flowers. In the kitchens, the work had started long before sunset. Grilled eel, glazed in soy and sugar, was laid on narrow platters. Delicate slices of watermelon were arranged in fan shapes. Bowls of cold buckwheat noodles shimmered with ice chips floating on their surface. Dishes meant to refresh in the heat, yet still dazzle the eye. When the first trays were carried out, 2 palace dogs walked with them, Goal and Chorong, not in the open where guests sat, but just behind, in the shadowed spaces between the serving paths. Their job was the same as always: guard the food until it reached the table, and be ready should any small trouble, a curious stray bird, a dish jostled too close to the ground, arise. From the garden's edge, Goul could see the guests in their summer hanbok, silk catching the lantern light in ripples of colour. Musicians played soft court melodies from a small pavilion by the pond, the notes mingling with the trickle of water from a stone fountain. The scent of the night was layered and rich: grilled meat, cold fruit, the faint tang of pickled vegetables, the smoky sweetness of incense drifting from tall brass stands near the tables. Chorong lifted her head now and then, watching the serving line move steadily from the kitchen doors to the far end of the garden. When the main courses were served, the dogs were led to a quieter corner where the kitchen staff had their own table set on low mats beneath a mulberry tree. A shallow bowl of chilled noodle broth was placed on the grass for each dog, mild, without strong spice, and perfectly cool. Goul lapped at his slowly, ears twitching at the faint laughter drifting from the feast. As the night deepened, the lantern light seemed to grow warmer, the air softer. Guests leaned back to talk in low voices, the musicians' melodies slowing to a gentle dreamlike pace. On the pond, the lotus blossoms floated like pale lanterns of their own, each one cradling a small reflection of the moon. By the time the last dishes were cleared and the lanterns began to go dark, the garden felt hushed, as if the feast had been a dream dissolving into the night air. The dogs followed the kennel master back through the cool stone corridors, the scents of summer still clinging faintly to their fur. And from this soft golden night, we'll walk toward one of the rarest moments in the palace kitchen, when the dogs stood watch not over food for the living, but a gift for the sea itself. It was early morning, long before the palace kitchens would normally stir to life. A thin mist curled over the courtyards, carrying the faint scent of salt from the distant coast. Today was a day set apart, one of the few times each year when the palace prepared an offering for the sea. The ceremony was an old one, rooted in the belief that the waters which fed the kingdom with fish and salt must be honoured. The food prepared would not be eaten by the king or his court. Instead, it would be carried to the shore and set adrift, a gift to the spirits of the deep. The kitchens worked in near silence. Large baskets of fresh fruit, pears, melons and grapes, were washed until they shone. Platters of grilled fish were laid out whole, their silver scales brushed with a thin glaze of sesame oil. Small cakes of rice and honey were wrapped in lotus leaves, tied neatly with thin cords of reed. Dalbit and Sori were the dogs chosen to accompany the cooks this day. They padded softly through the workroom, sniffing each dish as it was completed. Even though these foods would never touch a royal plate, they were prepared with the same care as the king's own meals. Spoilage or imperfection was unthinkable. The offering had to be perfect in every detail. Once everything was ready, the procession formed. Servants carried the trays on low tables balanced between poles, their steps slow and steady. The dogs walked alongside, ears twitching at the morning gull cries drifting in from the coast. The path to the sea wound beyond the palace walls, through narrow streets where early vendors were just setting out their baskets. The smell of tide water grew stronger, mingling with the faint tang of drying nets and the cool mineral scent of wet sand. At the shore, the cook set the offering on a small wooden raft, its surface lined with fresh pine boughs. The fruit gleamed in the pale light, the grilled fish catching the dawn's first gold. A small cup of clear rice wine was placed in the centre, its surface trembling with the movement of the tide. Dalbit stood at the water's edge, watching as the raft was pushed gently into the waves. Sori stayed a step behind, her gaze following until the colours of the offering blurred into the morning mist. The raft drifted out, carrying its scents to the wind, its purpose to the sea. The return to the palace was quiet. The dogs walked between the cooks, their paws leaving faint prints in the sand before the tide erased them. In the kitchens, the fires would soon be lit for the day's meals, but for that brief morning, the first work had been for the sea, not the court. And from the salt air and the soft crash of waves, we'll return to the warmth of the hearth, to a tale of the palace dogs on the coldest night of the year, when the kitchen fire never went out. Winter in the palace could be fierce, but there was one night each year when the cold seemed to press closer, sharper, more insistent than ever. It was the turn of the lunar calendar, the longest, coldest night, a night when the kitchens burned their fires without pause, keeping both food and people warm until the first pale light of morning. The hearths glowed from late afternoon onward, great iron pots set over steady flames. One held a thick beef bone broth, its surface shimmering with a thin golden layer of fat. Another simmered with a sweet red bean porridge. Azuki beans softened until they melted into the rice. The air was heavy with comfort, the warmth almost tangible against the skin. Dalbit lay closest to the largest hearth, his pale fur catching the flicker of the firelight. Beside him, Shrong curled on a straw mat, her head resting on her paws. Neither slept deeply. Their ears twitched at every clink of a ladle or rustle of cloth. They knew that this night's cooking was as much about guarding as it was about preparing. The cold outside was not just uncomfortable, it could spoil ingredients left too near a draught, or crack delicate porcelain bowls waiting to be used. The dogs padded the kitchen's edges, checking the darker corners where the warmth didn't quite reach. Every so often, a cook would squat down to rub their ears, murmuring thanks before returning to stir the pots. There is a small note in the household accounts from 1714 that mentions 2 hounds slept by the great fire through the long night and were given broth at dawn. The words are simple, but you can almost see it. The red glow of coals reflecting in their eyes, the sound of logs shifting in the heat, the gentle rise and fall of their breathing in time with the simmering broth. Around midnight, the cooks ladled out small bowls of the red bean porridge. A portion was set on the floor for the dogs, not sweetened like the king's serving, but warm and filling. Chorong lapped at hers slowly, the steam rising to curl around her whiskers. Dalbit finished first, then shifted closer to the hearth, letting the heat soak into his bones. The night stretched on, the wind outside rattling the shutters, but inside the fire never faltered. The kitchen's warmth seemed to push back the winter, holding it at the edges until the eastern sky began to pale. At dawn, the broth pot was opened one last time, and its rich scent filled the kitchen. The first bowls were carried to the royal quarters, the rest to the staff. The dogs received a small final serving before being led back to the kennels, their fur still holding the faint smoky perfume of the night's fire. And from this night of steady flames, we'll move to the final chapter. The day a royal kitchen dog's work quietly came to an end, and the palace marked his service in its own gentle way. It was spring again when Dalbit's service came to its quiet end. The palace gardens were dotted with pale blossoms, and the air was soft with the scent of wet earth and pine. He was older now, his once smooth stride slowed to a measured walk, his muzzle silvered, his eyes carrying the calm of many seasons spent between hearth and courtyard. That morning the kitchens worked as they always did, knives tapping, pots steaming, voices low and steady. Dalbit lay in his usual place near the main hearth, the warmth wrapping around him like an old friend. He no longer rose for every tray that passed. The younger dogs had taken on the brisk inspections and quick alerts. But now and then, when something new came from the pantry or the market, the head cook would bring it close, almost out of habit, and Dalbit would give it one last approving sniff. He had been at the palace since he was a pup, arriving in a basket lined with a quilted cloth. He had seen seasons turn over and over, the crisp bite of winter mornings, the green breath of spring, the heavy scent of summer feasts, the gold of autumn harvests. He had guarded banquets, stood watch during ceremonies, and rested through quiet afternoons when only the sound of simmering broth filled the air. That day, the head cook knelt beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You've done well," he murmured. It wasn't a grand speech, but the meaning was clear. Dalbit's service was ending not because he could no longer work, but because he had earned his rest. The kennel master led him back through the garden paths, where the sunlight fell in dappled patches through the blossoming trees. In the kennels, a fresh straw bed waited in a quiet corner. From now on, he would spend his days there, walking the gardens at his own pace, free from the calls of the kitchen bells. The palace did not hold formal farewells for its dogs, but that evening the head cook sent a small bowl of beef broth to the kennels, seasoned just enough to carry a rich, warm scent. Dalbit ate slowly, then lay down, his head on his paws, the sounds of the kitchens fading into the distance. In the weeks that followed, he could sometimes be seen lying in the sun near the garden wall, eyes half closed, as the younger dogs trotted past on their way to work. They would glance his way, tails giving a small respectful wag, before disappearing toward the kitchens. One morning, the kennel master found him still and quiet, the dawn light just beginning to touch the tiles above. He was buried near the herb garden, where the air was always fresh and the stream murmured softly through the stones. The head cook came to stand there for a while, his hands folded behind his back before returning to the day's work. The palace carried on, as it always did, the fires lit, the knives tapped, the scents of soup and spice winding through the air. But somewhere in its rhythm was the quiet echo of a pale-furred dog who had kept watch for many years, whose work had been as steady and essential as the beating of the kitchen's own heart. May these memories guide you into peaceful dreams, and if you drifted off somewhere along the way, you can let me know below. I'll take it as the highest compliment. Sweet dreams, friends. Until next time, soft whisper. Good night.